Alright, chapter 6, we are back. Welcome back to seeing this. Now, we are going over life in colonial America. With that being said, we have key terms and people in this chapter, such as New England, triangular trade, mid-Atlantic colonies, southern colonies, Magna Carta. Magna Carta is a very, very important piece that was on the DVA that y'all had, and a lot of you missed it. So make sure that you're zoning in on the read for that, as well as any other historical documents, such as the Bill of Rights of 1689 that came up right afterwards, House of Burgesses, Mayflower Compact, Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. These are all important government-related ideas or right-related. You've got Pilgrims and Puritans once again popping up. The Great Awakening, which is a religious movement. You have mercantilism, which is the idea of trade. You have Atlantic slave trade based off of that. And you've got some other people mixed in between. Now, the essential questions are what differences existed between the main regions of the 13 colonies. So one of the things that you need to be asking yourself is what specific types of differences, physically, economic, religious, the types of people that lived there, what were their daily lives consisting of due to that. That leads into question number 2. What was life like in colonial America? Well, depending on where you lived, it changed. If you were up in the north, you were less likely to be a full-time farmer. You were more likely to be into craftsmen, artisans, possibly selling or working in some kind of trade development path. Whereas if you were in the south, you're a full-time farmer, you've got the longer summers, less winter, and so you have that opportunity to grow crops more often. What factors contributed to religious freedom in the 13 colonies? So what paths had to take place, what actions had to take place in order to allow for that religious freedom? You had a lot of groups, such as your Puritans and Pilgrims, who came over because they wanted to start a new life, so to speak, and have the ability to have the religious openings. How did the economic system of mercantilism affect the 13 colonies? Now, this is a big one. You need to focus in on this because it has an aspect to the slave trade that you need to focus on. Now, differences emerged among the English colonies. By the mid-1730s, 13 English colonies existed along the Atlantic coast. New patterns of life developed in the 3 separate regions of the English colonies. Differences were based on the physical characteristics of their environment, their religious beliefs, and the origins of the colonies, the presence of slaves, and the different ways of earning a living. In New England, the colonies were Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and each had rocky soil and less fertile land for farming. Since the New England colonies were the farthest north, they had longer winters and a colder climate than any other colony. Many New Englanders had small farms where they grew crops for their own use, but not for sale. Others used forests in the region for lumber and building ships. These colonies were located near the ocean, where there was an abundance of whales and fish. Large members of New Englanders became sailors, fishermen, or merchants. The practice of religion, especially Puritanism, also remained important in New England. New Englanders frequently owned and manned ships. They carried sugar from the West Indies to New England, where it also was turned into rum. The rum was carried to Africa, where it was traded for slaves. New England merchants also carried sugar from the West Indies to England, where their ships were loaded with manufactured goods and sold back to New England. You will learn more about the triangular trade later in the chapter. Middle Atlantic colonies. The middle colonies were New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. They were located between New England and the southern colonies. Winters were not as harsh as New England, and summers were longer. Uncleared forests and fertile soils attracted many colonists to the area. Most of the sailors came from the Netherlands, such as Holland, Germany, Sweden, France, and Scotland. Settlers there focused on cutting down the trees and removing the stumps and stones from the soil so that it could be prepared for planting. Most of the forests in the Mid-Atlantic colonies gave birth to an active lumber and shipbuilding industry. The Middle Atlantic colonies were particularly well suited for small farms and soon became known as the breadbasket. It was here that most of the wheat, oats, barley, and rye were often grown. The fertile soil of the area even permitted a large amount of grain to be exported. People were also attracted to a greater atmosphere of religious freedoms. No single church or religion dominated the Mid-Atlantic colonies. These colonies had a greater religious diversity than either New England or the South. The main religious groups there were Anglicans, the Dutch Reformed Protestants, Catholics, and even Jews. Make sure that you are not visiting right now. Specifically you. I'll help you in a minute. I'm doing a video. I'll help you in a minute. I'm doing a video.
I'll help him.
Go help him. The southern colonies, such as Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, had a warmer climate than any other parts of colonial America. Land was flat and the soil was well suited for growing cash crops throughout the year. Southerners were largely English, Scots, and Scottish-Irish settlers who came to America for economic motives. In parts, England and Scotland and Northern Ireland, many poor farmers could not afford to buy their own land. English settlers, usually Anglican, which was the Church of England, but Irishmen settlers were often Presbyterian. In general, German and Scottish-Irish immigrants avoided living in the coastal settlements where English influence was strongest. They tended to settle further inland. Southern forests provided lumber, tar, and resin. Resin, which was made from the sap of pine trees, provided some of the best shipbuilding materials in the world. Development of the plantation system. Some Southerners developed plantations along major water routes. Each plantation was a large-scale agricultural operation of which 20 or more slaves worked crops such as tobacco, cotton, rice, and indigo, which is a blue dye used to color fabrics, for shipments to England in exchange for manufactured goods. The plantation system began in Virginia and spread to other parts of the southern colonies accessible by water. Larger plantations, which were often owned by rich families, depended on the use of enslaved peoples from Africa and their descendants as the main workforce. Landowners in the South Carolina region even learned important techniques used in Africa for growing rice from their slaves. The main crops planted on a plantation were very labor-intensive. A successful harbor depended on the slaves working from sunrise to sunset. Women usually worked the same hours as men, and they were expected to return to the fields not long after giving birth to their children. The mortality, which is death rate, among the slaves was high. Slave women were encouraged to have a large number of children to replace slaves that were lost. The great majority of whites did not live on plantations, but often lived on land such as smaller farms. Now, applying what you've learned, how did the settlers of the 13 colonies each adapt to their environment? So this goes back to that very first essential question. And how did the southern plantation system make that region unique? Which goes back to the second question as well as the first. So go back, identify what areas specifically focus on different physical characteristics and how that played into a part of their lives, such as their jobs and ways of making money. Colonial government. Now, before we get into colonial government, I just want to remind you, page 68, you are expected to complete by tomorrow, which is going to be Thursday, April 13th. Colonial government. Now, the colonists enjoyed several institutions of representative government based on both English political traditions and new practices that emerged in the colonies. Now, during the Middle Ages, England had developed traditions of liberty and limited self-government that were unique in Europe. The Magna Carta which was in 1215, the king was forced by his barons to promise not to take away any free man's property or to imprison any free man without following procedures established by the laws of the land. The Great Charter guaranteed individuals the right to a trial by their peers and forced their king to obtain the consent of a council of nobles after imposing any new taxes. So real quick, the Magna Carta is just basically sounding like what? Don't take away my rights. Don't take away the opportunities to have my voice heard. So what does that sound like for the American people later on in the years? Where did we use that? Where did we supplement that into our way of life? The British Parliament. In the Middle Ages, the English king summoned his nobles and representatives from counties and towns to show support for the crown. Parliament, which was developed into a national legislative consisting of nobles and elected representatives. New taxes had to be approved by Parliament. After two revolutions in 1600, Parliament achieved supremacy over the king. The Bill of Rights in 1689, we're going to focus on that right now. After a glorious Revolution of 1688, the rights of English subjects were confirmed by the Bill of Rights in 1689. English rulers agreed not to have a standing army or to propose new taxes without the permission of Parliament. The English Bill of Rights also guaranteed trial by jury, the right to petition Parliament, and other personal freedoms, as well as freedom of speech and debate in Parliament. So once again, how did the Bill of Rights play into... I get it, I see it. Go away. How did the... Can't even read it. The English Bill of Rights also guaranteed trial by jury and the right to petition of Parliament and their personal freedoms as well as freedom of speech and debate in Parliament. Go away before I yell at you. The Magna Carta, the Rights of Parliament, and English Civil War and English Bill of Rights all combined to establish important traditions of individual liberty and limited government that were familiar to the English colonies. The rise of colonial self-government. Key important pieces: the House of Burgesses, the Mayflower Compact, town meetings, and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. I want y'all to independently go back in and read over those, simply to zone in on those. Those are things that we missed highly, so I want y'all to go back in and have that ready for discussion on tomorrow. Later colonial government, we had freedom of press, which came in with the colony of New York. John Peter Zinniger published a newspaper accusing the governor of New York of corruption. So once again, you start to see how things back then played an important part into the Bill of Rights and amendments that we have to the Constitution. Now, it's page 71, and I'm going to stop at the growth of religious freedom, and I'll see y'all next time.